So this question is very simple. It's an easy one to answer, that the Julian family was not the first Black residents of Oak Park. But it's kind of very complicated. I think that's also the history of them as the first prominent, extremely successful African-American family to move to the community, moving right into the estate section. It made a big impact on some people and sort of got picked up in the media as all white Oak Park having its first Black family. And I think that's the kind of nuances. And over time, even though we and others have told the stories of the Julians and this earlier community, there wasn't a Black community I'll talk about more in a couple of minutes, and yet it's out there. And people who tune into a program like this, you here today, for instance, you are more knowledgeable perhaps than some who just are more little history buffs, but maybe not as knowledgeable about Oak Park history. So let's go on to the next slide, Rachel. So the story of the Julians, I'll kind of recap it just to kind of get us grounded, this is the Julian family home at the corner of Chicago and East and Oak Park. The Julian family bought it 49 into early 50. There's sources that kind of conflict exactly when they actually closed on it. But this home is still owned by Faith Julian, their daughter, who still lives in the home. And yes, they moved into this home, and twice the house was attacked. Once before they moved in, once after they lived there. Luckily, nobody was hurt. The human beings weren't hurt. There's some damage done to the house. And it both shocked, and some people in Oak Park rallied to the Julians. The people were never caught who did this. And so it became both sort of black eye for the community, and maybe let some people know that there was this Black family living in the community and who chose Oak Park. So next slide, please. And here's an image showing that the Chicago Sun-Times that year in 1950 had named Dr. Julian the Man of the Year for all his work on chemicals, synthesizing chemicals that were so helpful to people in so many ways, including helping people with rheumatoid arthritis and other sort of ailments that he was able to help them. And there's a photograph that appeared. Let's go to the next slide. So yes, this horrible thing happened. Yes, the Julians were, according to the 1950 census, there were 75 African-American people living in the community. Dr. Julian, of course, world famous, many patents, head of the Glidden research division, Glidden Paint Company, later on had his own laboratory. His wife, Anna, she herself a very accomplished person. By some sources, the first African-American woman to get a PhD in sociology in the United States, very involved in the community. She was on the board of Rosary College, now Dominican University, leaders in the civil rights movement. And also, of course, we have Julian Middle School in the community today to sort of that legacy going on. So people have this real story, but it didn't start, both their story and the story of African Americans didn't start in 1950 when they moved into the house. So I'll go to the next page, the next slide, I should say. Those of you who are more involved in our organization in the community have heard tell perhaps of the Mount Carmel Baptist Church, the 1905 structure that was built on Westgate, today's Westgate. I was called William Street then. And by 1920, the U.S. Census shows more than 150 African-American residents living in what's now Oak Park. Some other African-American people living across Harlem and River Forest, kind of nearby to this church. And it was sort of a thriving community. It was still small in numbers relative to the population total. And I think part of the reason when the Julians moved in, some of the Chicago papers and Time magazine talked as if that, the first Black resident moved in kind of thing. So there was sort of this in the media and also in the public imagination, because by 1950, that smaller number of African-American residents in the community, people thought that people who had moved in since this church was torn down in the early 1930s didn't necessarily know there had been sort of a community center and this active Black population. So, and yet, if people were paying attention and you look back through the historical record, in 1938, Lou Pope graduated from Oak Park River Forest High School. There was a celebrated incident. He was a star of the football team. They're undefeated. and the Miami Senior High School invited OPRF to play them in a kind of a mythical national championship game, and the invitation was withdrawn when they realized there wasn't one black player on the team. So long story short, he ended up not traveling with the team. The team sort of caved into Jim Crow laws, and he was not allowed to play in this game. He actually technically said, "Oh, it's okay. I don't need to go. It's better that they go and play." But years later, he felt kind of pressure on that. So here's this man, even in the 30s, before Dr. Julian's in here, he and his family lived here, and there's this sort of got a lot of attention in the press that he ended up not traveling with the team. So again, there's these different layers, but this earlier layer I wanted to kind of tie back into is Dr. Julian, and this is from the Oakleys in December of 1937, when this whole thing was happening with the football team at OPRF about to travel to Miami to play in this game in the Orange Bowl. And he writes this stirring, really long letter that's published in the Oakleys, "The Negro, His Plight in America." And he talks about, I'll just read a portion of this. "My fellow readers of Oakleys will certainly be gracious enough to permit in your columns a word from a black brother of Lewis Pope, young athlete, whom authorities of Oak Park's high school have agreed to take out of their lineup on Christmas Day in exchange for the privilege of playing Miami senior high school football." He goes on and he says all of these things about how he was looking for homes in the area before he bought a house in Maywood. And the only place he could stay, even though he was well-traveled and had been in Europe as the Nazis were rising to power, and he couldn't get a room in our local YMCA because they did not allow a black person to stay there at that time. And so he was sort of making this case that like, you say you're such a great community, but you're not really living up to your ideals, your stated ideals. And this letter sent from nearby Maywood, where he was living then, was one early connection with Oak Park. So some people would have heard of Julian, knew he lived right nearby in Maywood. But separately, he and his family joined First Congregational Church in the 1940s, even before coming to Oak Park. And there was a sort of famous minister from 1930 to 1949, Reverend Albert Buckner Coe, and he used to have a Sunday evening forum, and he'd invite African-American famous and notable poets and writers and singers and performers. James Weldon Johnson came several times, the lyricist of Lift Every Voice and Sing, considered sort of the Negro national anthem we used to say at that time. So really kind of in the community, the Julians were more and more involved even before moving to the community. So again, the nuances, it's not just moving in, it's this backstory that we should know as citizens, and that it's not just one story. There's these multiple stories that we need to keep on learning and telling. Next slide, please. And then I'm going to finish up just exposing you to another quick story. This house still stands at 738 Forest. Nathan Brown, the gentleman driving this rig, lived there with his family. His wife, Louisa, is not shown. And this is his daughter, Dorothy Brown. And Dr. Julian stayed with them while he was looking for a house, what became Maywood. And it's actually some conflicting stories, but he might have stayed there multiple times. They rented out a room, especially even we didn't have true Jim Crow like in the South, but it wasn't easy for an African-American person to find a place to stay in Chicago in the North. And so she, in the end of this letter that I was mentioning a couple minutes ago, he talks about this beautiful Christian home of a Negro woman who allowed him to stay. And the Browns had moved to Oak Park around 1903 when this Dorothy was a young girl, about 5 years old. She ended up attending homeschool, and she attended Oak Park River Forest High School, though she ended up not graduating. So you have these like layers of the community that we should learn more of these stories, and we don't have a monopoly on these stories. You know, we want to hear more stories. People might have personal stories to tell us about this topic. Next slide, please. And you can find a little commercial here at the end. If you haven't yet purchased a copy, we have on sale this month for $10, Suburban Promised Land, the book we published. Local authors, Stan West, Peggy Cinco, current president of the Historical Society, myself, and Eve Hughes, that tells some of these stories. It has photographs and illustrations, so please take advantage of that. And then also, now that we're reopened, if you go to the next slide, and the last one of my presentation, is we're open now again. So we still have open house, the legacy of fair housing, our exhibit on the second floor. And this is a photograph taken at its opening. We've already lost Bobby Raymond and Ginny Caston, who were among the people in the 60s and 70s that were trying to make Oak Park a more racially integrated and fair community. And the Robinets on the left, who when, before they moved to Oak Park, they had to buy their home with a straw buyer in 1965. And in 1968, Harriet Robinet wrote an article on moving to Oak Park, and the Red Book said on its cover, first Black family moving to Oak Park. So again, this layers of history that people don't always understand, that there's actually more than one story, and they should learn some of these other stories. So that's it for now, and I'll just turn it back over to Rachel.
Thank you, Frank. I want to take this opportunity before I start my presentation to say, if you have any questions about all of our program today as we're going along, please leave those in the chat box. If we have time, we'll get to some questions at the end about the program that we're doing today. So with that in mind, I will move on to my next question, which is my most frequently asked question that I get at the museum. I get a lot of requests from people who want to research their own home or their building in Oak Park and River Forest. Especially during the pandemic, I've been working a lot on our research service that we have for people, which I've been able to do even while the museum was closed. So I will take this opportunity to say this. We are a nonprofit organization. We're not a library, and we're not affiliated with either of the village governments. So we do have a fee associated with our research, but as you are able to, we have a couple of options that you can take advantage of. One of which is, since the museum is now open again, if you are able to visit the museum and want to do some research, then we just charge our museum entrance fee. And if you are not able to make it to the museum, then we have a research service available that I can send you research from what we have in the museum. And at the moment, that costs $25 per hour. And with that hour, you usually get a lot of good information. So that's a little bit of my plug today as well. But I'm going to start by talking strictly about home research today. And what I mean by home is any building, really. If I slip up today and keep saying home, I'm not just talking about single family houses. I'm talking about commercial buildings, apartment buildings, etc. So some of you might already have done research with us at various points. So you might recognize the materials that I'm talking about today, but no house is the same, first of all. So sometimes I can find a lot of information about a particular house, and sometimes there's not as much. And it really doesn't matter. Some people have the expectation that if your house is very large or grand or important looking, then that would be why we would have more information on it versus not. But that's not at all the case. For us, it's really more about luck, maybe I would say, because some of the smaller, more quiet looking homes, we might have a donation from one of the previous owners that includes a lot of interior photos or information about the house. Or for another example, if your house has been sold a lot of times, then it might come up very often in the newspaper, and we can find information that way. So it's never easy to tell how much information we'll be able to find, but we typically always find something. If you are looking to start a general history of your building, there are some resources that I want to focus on today The ones on your screen is what I'll be talking most about. Some of my favorite materials that we have in the museum are our collection of listing sheets that we've gotten from various realtors throughout the years. And again, it kind of depends how many we have of these for a particular building, depending on how many times it's been sold or just how many of these still exist. But typically, this is where I will start. And if we have some for your house, they could range anywhere from the 1920s to the 1990s. And they'll include information like the owners who were listing it at the time, or obviously some descriptions about the house at the time, or often photos from the date, as you can see on the left. And like I said, it really just depends on a lot of different factors. So we may be able to find a lot of information based on this. So the next thing that people very often ask me is, do I have a file on your house? And the simple answer is no, because I think people have the conception that sometimes we have or do a lot of research on particular houses, and when you come in, we'll be able to just pull a file for you and it'll all be there. And our process is really more about digging and discovery and looking through as many resources as we can find to be able to pull that story together. So when you are doing research with us, you become the detective, just as much as I enjoy being the detective in the museum and putting a lot of your research together. With that being said, what we do have, what I'll usually start with also, is street files, what we call our street files. We have file folders that are organized by block. So when you come in, I will give you the file for your block, and that will often include newspaper articles or research that previous owners have already compiled, or some other general information and any sort of thing that we come across about a particular house on that block. And that's usually also a good starting point for us to find some of these stories that we can then go off of and use some of our other resources to expand on and get more of a story. So I'll touch briefly on some of the other sorts of specific resources that we have available as well. And for this, after we've looked at listing sheets and after we've looked at the file for your block, it really depends on if you've got particular questions. So some people are looking just for construction information if they're looking to renovate their house, or some people are looking specifically for previous owners. So we've got, for construction, we can look at all of our years of Sanborn maps, which is what you see on the right. And that'll give you some construction information and kind of the footprint of buildings throughout time. Or on the left is an example of our city directories and our phone books, which we have a collection of. Our earliest city directory goes back to 1886. So it really gives us a range where we can find previous residents. And those can also help us sort of date a building, depending on if we know when it was built or not. We also have biographical files of information on architects, where if we know, or maybe we are trying to find out who the architect of a building is, then we can sometimes find that and more information about that person. We have bound copies of the Oak Leaves beginning in 1902 and the Wednesday Journal beginning in 1980. And in the previous slide, you saw some of our bound copies of the Oak Leaves. So when you come in, we're looking at actual newspapers very often throughout time. And sometimes that'll give us a date for a building permit that was taken out on the building. Or sometimes there's an article about a previous owner or the house itself. So I'm just sort of buzzing through some of the other resources that we have, but I want to give you a sense of all of the different types of directions that we can take and dig into when you're doing your research. And for more information on any of the other types of resources that we might have available, I will point you to our website here. Because you can go to oprfmuseum.org. At the top, we've got a bar that says research at the museum. And then within that, we've got a couple of things that you can do to learn more about specific resources we have on buildings. We also have some more information about genealogical research, which I did not talk about today. Although it all ties in, especially when you're looking at previous owners, information from everywhere can always be helpful. So this is a lot of information that I've given to you today, but again, I wanted to give you a sense of all of the types of things that we have available at the museum. And the one point that I want to leave you with today is that I have never had a researcher leave empty-handed. So no matter what, we will always be able to find something. And hopefully, especially if you've got specific questions or if you're just looking to find out anything that you can, we will be able to help you. And if we don't have something, then we can point you to other resources in the community or in the county, all of that sort of thing. And I will also leave you with a plug that, like Frank and me said, the museum is open again. According to state guidelines, we were closed as of November, and as of a couple of weeks ago, we've been able to reopen. So that means that you can schedule your research appointment if you are able and willing to come into the museum. Or like I said before too, we have a research service where if you're not, get in contact with me and I can talk to you about how I can send you research. And that is about it for me. So what I will say next is I will plug a little bit more of the events that we have coming up. And as I do that, if you have questions for Frank or me from anything that we've talked about today, please leave them in the chat box and I can see if I can answer some questions. Or if you have other questions, if you'd like to see us answer something on a next episode of Ask the Historians, or if you just, again, want to see if you can come in to do some research on something, then contact me on our, you can contact us on our website, or you can use my email address that you see on the screen. So our next programs are going to be in March. Our next Inside OPRF Museum will be on March 18th. On March 20th, we're going to have a special program. Leslie Goddard, who did our program on Marshall Fields in December, is going to come back for another virtual program. She's going to portray Amelia Earhart. And then our next Ask the Historians will be March 26th. So you can learn more and sign up for any of those programs on our website as well. And I think, I want to say too, again, please send in your questions. We would also love to talk to you anybody is interested about volunteering for a future episode of Inside OPRF Museum or Ask the Historians. If you've got anything that you'd like to talk about, then I'd be happy to talk with you about doing a presentation. So I think that is about it for us today. And I will leave it at that. And thank you all so much for coming. And again, leave us your questions, tell your friends, and we'll be putting this video up on YouTube, so you can share that as you will. And we would love to get in touch with you.
A quick thing, I see Rachel, Gary's asking about pre and post corporation.
Mm-hmm.
In Oak Park was a municipality incorporated in 1902. So there's only building permits after 1902.
Mm-hmm.
Before 1902 in Oak Park, Village Hall does not have anything because it was part of Cicero Township. So those records are not known to exist anywhere. Same thing for Rare Forest, which was incorporated in 1880, but not all the permits exist even as early as 1880. So we can help you guide you through some of those things when you stop off or call or do research. So thanks for the question, Gary. And yeah, we're here to try to help you.